it's interesting to see what this led to 50 years later, where now China is our biggest rival. Arguably, China is getting far closer than the Soviet Union ever did at outcompeting us for the world. The 3 closest times we've ever gotten to World War III, and here's the scary part. We might even have to update this list one day.
This was one of the only wars where 2 nuclear-armed rivals were directly fighting, making it one of the most dangerous moments in modern history. In 1998, both India and Pakistan openly tested nuclear weapons, and just a year later, they were at war with each other.
What's so fascinating about this conflict, it's post-Cold War. We thought the world had avoided World War III because the Soviet Union had collapsed, the communist world had mostly fallen apart.
Fighting began when Pakistani troops, disguised as militants, crossed the border that divides Indian and Pakistani forces in Kashmir, and captured more than 100 positions on the Indian side.
I'm going to say a controversial thing right now. I'm going to say something pretty controversial. I am more concerned about India, Pakistan, and China, the Kashmir region, causing some sort of nuclear war than I am about North Korea. I think that if you were to leave North Korea alone, they're probably not going to do anything. I mean, they haven't done anything yet, and they've had a nuke for almost 20 years now. However, China, Pakistan, India, they all, despite China not so much, but India and Pakistan, they despise each other. They both have nukes. They're both constantly fighting over there. This is probably the #1 region I'm most concerned about.
From those mountain ridges, they had a clear view of India's main highway, so their artillery could threaten supply lines and cut India off. At first, India thought it was just small groups of insurgents, but as battles grew, it became clear that Pakistan's regular army was heavily involved. India responded with Operation Vijay, sending in 200,000 troops. The Indian Navy also prepared Operation Talwar, a naval move to blockade Pakistan's port city of Karachi. Later, Pakistan's prime minister admitted that if this blockade had gone ahead, the country had only about 6 days of fuel left.
Jeez, 6 days of fuel. You think they would have got desperate enough to start launching things? I mean, who knows?
During the war, some Pakistani officials hinted that if the war spread, they might use any weapon in their arsenal, which was a veiled nuclear threat. U.S. intelligence even reported that Pakistan had started moving nuclear warheads forward, so India also readied its missiles. On the brink of a full...
Oh, man, this is so stressful. I still stress about this. Like I said, I still stress about this. I mean, damn, I don't even know if North Korea... I think the Korean War is going to be on this list, but the current iteration... I mean... There's so many, there's massive religious differences, cultural differences. The Indian-Pakistan rivalry is so intense, even to this day.
Blown nuclear war, the United States and other world powers decided to step in. President Bill Clinton told Pakistan's leader, Nawaz Sharif, to pull his forces back or face complete isolation. And within weeks, Pakistani troops began withdrawing, and the whole situation de-escalated.
Thank goodness. I can't believe we're starting off this list. This is such a cool event. Not even cool or whatever. This is an interesting way to start this video off because when you hear World War III, everyone's minds, I think, kind of goes to the Cold War somewhat. There's post-World War III events and then, you know, during World War III events. But this is an odd one because it was right after that whole thing was over. Humanity thought we escaped it. We're all gonna live. And then this occurs.
Could have ended pretty badly, but imagine being the one making those calls, deciding whether to retaliate or negotiate. Checkpoint, Charlie standoff.
Checkpoint.
In the autumn of 1961,
So here's a Cold War conflict.
U.S. tanks stood face-to-face in Germany, fully armed, for 16 hours. After World War II, when Germany had been split into 2 parts, many people living in East Germany were unhappy, as life there was poor. For that reason, they escaped simply by walking across the border into West Berlin, and by 1961...
You could do that in those days, just walk on over.
Around 2.5 million people had left. Keep in mind that at that time, the Berlin Wall hadn't been built yet.
Not yet, but it will be. Dude, I was in LA the other day. I just saw they had like slabs of the Berlin Wall. I was just walking by to my car, and I think it was in North Hollywood or something. And I just like randomly stumbled upon 4 huge slabs from the Berlin Wall. I was like, holy crap. I was not expecting to see that that day, and I thought it was really cool. I actually had to take a moment to like stare at this because I, as a lover of history, it's so fascinating.
East Germany was falling apart because it was losing so many workers, and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev called the situation simply disastrous. He decided something must be done, and that summer, he met John F. Kennedy. Khrushchev told him that he wanted the U.S. and Western allies to leave Berlin, and he wanted the city to be demilitarized. Kennedy refused, and East German leaders secretly made plans to close the border. On what seemed a normal night.
I mean, I wish I had more of the information, but I mean, yeah, I guess it makes sense for JFK here to refuse.
Of August, East German soldiers suddenly rolled out barbed wire and blocked every street leading into West Berlin.
I probably wouldn't leave Berlin either. If I'm just being real, if I'm playing as that position, why? Why would I leave Berlin? Well, especially when there's no wall.
They began building what would soon become the Berlin Wall. Families that were divided in the two parts of the city were torn apart, and angry protests broke out. Kennedy decided to not send American forces to tear down the barriers, but to send Vice President Lyndon Johnson and more U.S. troops to West Berlin to show support. The situation got more serious when just 2 months after the wall was built, an American diplomat tried to cross into East Berlin, but was stopped by East German guards at a border crossing known as Checkpoint Charlie. The United States argued that only the Soviets, not the East Germans, had the right to control their movements in Berlin. U.S. General Lucius Clay ordered tanks to drive right up to the checkpoint, and the Soviets answered by sending their own tanks, which stopped just a short distance away. For 16 tense hours, American and Soviet tanks faced each other at point-blank range, with their guns loaded. The order to fire never came, but for almost a full day, the world was in danger. Any small mistake, like a nervous soldier firing too soon or a command being misunderstood, could have started a war that no one could control. Finally, communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev helped calm.
Out of all the events that we're going to learn about today, I would rank this on the lower end of the tier that could eventually cause World War III. That's just my opinion, but this one feels like it could have gotten violent and there could have been a small skirmish in Berlin, but I don't know if this would have caused like the nukes to be launched. You know, like, okay, a soldier does fire on the other side. I would assume the fighting would just stay in Berlin. I don't know how much that would escalate. Of course, it's still a possible World War III threat for sure, but I don't see this specifically causing World War III as much as some of these other events. If you're like, Drew, what the hell are you talking about? This definitely could have. Maybe. I'm just saying these other events that you're going to see for the rest of this video, they make way more sense to me that it literally is like nukes are being launched. The buttons are about to be pressed.
The situation. A Soviet tank pulled back a few meters. Then an American tank did the same, and one by one, the rest of the tanks followed. Pristina Airport.
I mean, Berlin was surrounded, you know, like the Allies would have possibly lost Berlin, but it's crazy that the Americans did not back down first in that situation, to be quite honest, but...
Standoff. In June 1999, just hours after the Kosovo War ended, a small move nearly set off a huge crisis. Russia had wanted its own peacekeeping zone in Kosovo, but NATO had refused. Still, suddenly a bunch of Russian armored vehicles drove out of Bosnia towards Pristina, the capital of Kosovo. Their goal was to take control of Pristina's airport before NATO could get there. For NATO's commander, this looked like a serious challenge, and he gave orders for British and French paratroopers to seize the airport by helicopter to get there before the Russians.
However, very interesting because remember, this is a Russia that just is newly independent, I guess you could say, after the Soviet Union was dissolved.
The officers on the ground resisted. The French pulled out of the helicopter plan, and the British stood down. The Norwegian Special Forces and Britain's SAS were the first into the city.
The funny thing about this one is you should not be surprised at all that the Balkans, of all places, would cause the world to go to war, because it's done that before.
But the Russians still reached the airport first. That evening, NATO's general met with Russia's general, trying to calm the situation face to face. Clark, the commander who had the helicopter idea, still worried that Russia might try to fly in reinforcements using transport planes, so he pressed again to have the runway blocked, but bad weather made it impossible that night. According to Captain James Blunt, who was there, Clark even gave an order.
Blunt, the musical artist?
Order to overpower the Russians. Jackson refused, famously saying, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you." In the end, British commanders were only given permission to surround the airfield, not to shut down the runway itself. Meanwhile, the United States pressured neighboring countries. Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania all refused Russia the use of their airspace, which stopped any chance of Russian reinforcements arriving by air. However, there was yet another danger. The Kosovo Liberation Army opposed the Russian presence and could easily have turned the standoff into a firefight. Luckily,
man, it's kind of a miracle that they didn't. I'm like learning about this situation. I'm like, wow, surprised that the Balkans didn't cause another world war.
Though, instead of fighting, talks brought a compromise. Russia dropped its demand for a separate sector and agreed that its peacekeepers would be spread across Kosovo, working alongside NATO rather than controlling their own.
This is funny because Kosovo still ended up getting its independence.
Exclusive zone. The crisis slowly faded, and that October, the airport reopened as a military base with both NATO and Russian troops guarding it. Stanislav.
Yeah, okay. So, again, I feel like I'd rank that kind of lower on the list. Now, Stanislav, this is the best example. This is most people's, it's in the top two, I feel like, closest we got to World War III moments.
Petrov incident. We could say that Officer Stanislav Petrov from the Soviet Union saved the world.
Yes. That is what a lot of videos talk about here on YouTube and on the History Channel, I'm assuming, on the network TV.
If it weren't for him, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. That's because on September 26, 1983, just after midnight, alarms went off deep inside a Soviet command bunker near Moscow. The computers showed something terrifying. An American nuclear missile had just been launched, and then 4 more followed.
Keep this in mind. This is not just like we don't know how this could have happened and then this could have happened and then we don't know how much a certain conflict could have escalated. This situation is there's literally nukes coming at him according to his data and his information. He only has one option, and that is to press his own nukes to fly back at the West and back at America.
According to Soviet military rules, such a warning meant that the officers needed to prepare an immediate counterstrike. Within minutes, the order could have gone out to launch thousands of Soviet nuclear warheads, triggering a full-scale nuclear war. The officer on duty that night was Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, and he had been trained to make his decisions according to what the system said. However, according to his intuition, something didn't add up. A real US first strike, he thought, would never be just 5 missiles. It would be hundreds, maybe thousands, designed to wipe out the Soviet arsenal in one blow.
Thank goodness he came to that conclusion. Because that is the assumption. It's horrifying to think about, but that is what a lot of the generals in general think about. Sorry, the pun there, but they're like, okay, if we just launch our own nukes to take out all of their nuclear facilities first, then we can just end this. That is the general thinking. But I mean, the thing is, like, when you're in a stressful environment like this guy thinks that he might possibly die. To make the right call and make the right decision, thank goodness this guy was in charge.
And checked the ground radar, which luckily showed nothing. So, against all rules and protocol, he made his choice and reported the alarm as false. Not having 100% certainty, he waited anxiously for the next minutes, but nothing happened. So Petrov's gamble had been right. Later investigations revealed—
Is there a movie about this? I don't know if you can make a whole movie about this incident, but there probably should be, honestly.
What really happened. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had fooled the satellites into thinking missiles were rising from US bases.
That's the crazy thing. It was just something as simple as that. Simple as sunrise shining off clouds. Like, that's terrifying. Imagine that was humans' doom right there. That could have been our doom. Something so stupid like that.
This happened at a time when US-Soviet relations were at their most dangerous point in decades. Just weeks earlier, Soviet forces had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people, including a US congressman, and NATO was preparing to deploy Pershing 2 missiles in Europe that could strike Moscow in minutes.
Yeah, I remember reading about that event. There's all sorts of, like, animations about that sort of thing. Both sides, unfortunately, blew up planes like that accidentally. It's a whole list of very sad events where we blew up planes that probably shouldn't have been.
Soviet leaders were convinced that NATO might launch a surprise nuclear attack. Afterward, Petrov was questioned, and they buried the entire incident in secrecy. He was never awarded honors, nor promoted, with the whole world not knowing that he saved humanity for years. The
plane that I think about is the one that the U.S. shot down in Iran, and that was a complete mistake. But again, it's real sad.
War. This was a prolonged war, where the idea of using nuclear weapons was continuously under consideration.
Korean War is a good one. Here we go. We were talking about North Korea. And again, I made my controversial statement. I think that the North Koreans, for the most part currently, I mean, they talk a big game, but sometimes they want food. Sometimes they want whatever they want. Just they'll start ramping up their missile tests and things like that when they want something. But I don't think that they're brave enough to do it. Because remember, China is a big factor why they won't cause an actual conflict. Like, China is their daddy. You know what I'm saying? China controls them in a way. And I don't even think China really likes North Korea all that much. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure Xi Jinping, the leader of China, would much rather have Kim Jong-un in charge of the Korean Peninsula instead of the South, a unified South Korean peninsula, and having like a Western allied country right on his borders. But they're kind of just having to make do.
And you'll soon understand why. On June 25th, 1950...
Oh, this is going to be the MacArthur comment. This one is scary because we're only 5 years from the first nuclear tests, the first nuclear bomb, and people clearly kind of thought of it still kind of as like this miracle weapon, but also probably not fully grasping the scale of it. Obviously, Oppenheimer did. If you watch the Oppenheimer movie, if you've looked into Oppenheimer, the dude that made the nuclear weapons, he grasped it, but I feel like a lot of leadership inside of the U.S., and especially the generals, did not fully understand the power they had.
North Korean troops, trained and supplied by the Soviet Union, crossed the border with South Korea. The South was completely unprepared. They had no tanks, only a small air force, and their soldiers were trained mostly for fighting small guerrilla groups, not a full-scale war. Within just 3 days, the capital city of Seoul had fallen, and within 2 months, North Korean forces had almost pushed their enemies into the sea, trapping them inside a shrinking area of land called the Pusan Perimeter.
Yeah, isn't this where Busan is? Then the Americans come, not even just Americans, like the whole world came to aid the South. I don't know why Turkey's one of the countries that comes to mind. But yeah, I mean, just look at this participating countries list. Obviously, certain countries participated in other ways, but whole world was getting involved in this one.
Enemies into the sea, trapping them inside a shrinking area of land called the Pusan Perimeter. The United Nations, led mainly by the United States, threw everything it could into stopping North Korea. This wasn't just a war between the two Korean states, but one between the United States and its allies on one side, and China and the Soviet Union on the other.
Yes, because remember, just a single year earlier, the communists won in China. So that's terrifying to the world at this time because the Cold War was very apparent, even before this time, but the West thought, okay, we have to worry about Stalin, this is before Stalin's death, and the Soviet Union, that's it. And then all of a sudden, boom, millions of people are now under a new communist regime in China, and now we're seeing it again in Korea. And this is how you can kind of see the whole theory about the domino effect. Once you let one country fall to communism, then it all begins to fall.
In September, the U.S. launched a pretty risky plan, the landing at Incheon. American Marines and South Korean troops stormed the beaches far behind enemy lines, cutting off North Korea's supplies and forcing them to retreat. UN forces then went north, captured Pyongyang, and pushed all the way to the Yalu River, which marked the border with China. For a short moment, it looked like the whole peninsula might be reunited under the South, but then China stepped in. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers secretly crossed the Yalu River and launched sudden attacks in October.
And remember, these are fresh. I mean, China was pretty much already militarized for a while there because they had just ended the Chinese Civil War.
Arrival completely changed the war, as U.S. and UN forces were pushed back, and by early 1951, Seoul had fallen again, only to be retaken by the UN just weeks later. After this back and forth...
I mean, we would have needed the entire world to fight China. I mean, China, they have just such a crazy population. It's not surprising that the nuked idea was thrown around, but as someone as big as MacArthur to suggest using nukes, that's scary.
The war slowed down and turned into a deadlock, with trenches being built and both sides fighting around the original dividing line. Due to this stall, at one point, U.S. generals, including Douglas MacArthur, suggested using nuclear weapons against North Korea or China. Bombers were even loaded with practice versions of atomic bombs to prepare for such an order.
I'm not surprised that they thought about it. I am not surprised at all.
President Truman admitted the option was always under active consideration. But Washington held back, afraid that dropping atomic bombs would bring the Soviet Union directly into the war and turn Korea into the beginning of World War III.
Yes, because remember, they had just built their own nuke. It probably would have, I think. At that time, everyone was probably not as aware of how dangerous these weapons were. They weren't as big as we know them. Obviously, this is far before the time of like the Tsar Bomba, for instance, the biggest bomb ever dropped. But because now you hear all these like references of like 10,000 times bigger than the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. These were bigger bombs than Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but it wasn't as big as they were going to get. Regardless, I feel like this probably could have caused at least nukes to have been thrown back and forth.
China also prepared itself for the possibility of nuclear strikes, but in the end, no bombs were dropped. The world came very close to nuclear war, but both sides stepped back from the edge. The fighting ended with an armistice, with the two Koreas remaining divided and separated by a heavily armed strip of land called the Demilitarized Zone. No peace treaty was ever signed.
Yeah, it's still to this day an ongoing war.
Which means the war is technically still not finished even today. Able Archer.
And it's crazy that they actually got their own nuke. North Korea did. I mean, I guess it's inevitable. There was 9 nuclear countries, 10 ever, 1 demilitarized. But we are kind of gearing up where it seems like the more we go into the future, the more countries that are going to get access to these human civilization-ending weapons.
83. In November 1983, what was supposed to be just a normal training exercise almost destroyed the whole world. NATO was running its yearly war game, called Able Archer, to test how well its systems would work if a crisis with the Soviet Union ever escalated to nuclear.
Interesting 83 time. Wasn't that also when Stanislav saw those weapons, that weapon warning, the wrong one?
War. However, that year, the exercise looked so realistic that many in Moscow became convinced it might not be an exercise at all, but a cover for a real first strike. To understand why, you need to see the background. In the early 1980s, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were at their lowest point in decades. In this tense environment, Able Archer 83 began, but this time, it wasn't just routine drills. NATO added new coded messages, radio silence to mimic combat conditions, and even brought in political leaders like
I think there's also a desperation at this point seen by the Soviet Union. I don't think they got as desperate as they would come in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years, because it got really bad, obviously, for the Soviets in the 80s. This ultimately led to their demise. But Soviet Union was not doing that was not their time in the 80s, that's for sure.
Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl to participate. NATO forces practiced moving step by step through the nuclear readiness levels, from DEFCON 5 all the way to DEFCON 1, the stage just before actually launching nuclear weapons.
DEFCON
the Soviet intelligence mistook these moves as actual preparations for nuclear war.
Is that an old Polish-Lithuanian? This is the old Lithuanian flag or something like that?
And the reaction in Moscow was immediate. Soviet nuclear-capable aircraft were placed on high alert, and the 4th Air Army began loading nuclear warheads onto planes. Some reports suggest intercontinental ballistic missiles were also prepared. The scariest thing of them all is that at the time, NATO had no idea that the Soviet Union was doing all of this, or that they mistook the training for the real thing this badly. What prevented disaster was the choice of a single American officer, Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz. He noticed the unusual Soviet response, but instead of raising NATO's alert to match theirs, something that might have confirmed Moscow's fears, he recommended doing nothing until the exercise ended. It was a gamble, but it avoided giving the Soviets even more fears or a reason to act.
They was paranoid. They was like the old leader Stalin. Stalin was very paranoid.
On November 11th, when Able Archer ended, the Soviets stood down. Later on, thanks to intelligence from KGB double agent Oleg Gordievsky, the West learned just how close the Soviets had come to believing a nuclear strike was underway.
Wow.
And President Reagan was shocked, admitting he hadn't realized how deeply Soviet leaders feared an American attack. The experience helped push him toward arms control talks with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, they got really paranoid at this time. I mean, again, I think that what I was saying a little bit earlier, I think there was a little bit of a fear of just the 80s was not a good time for the Soviet Union, so they got even more paranoid than usual. Maybe if they had been doing better back at home economically and in all sorts of other ways, maybe they wouldn't be as fearful.
In the years that followed. Sino-Soviet border clashes.
Oh, here's a good one. I love this one.
Russia and China are today seen as partners, but it's a relatively...
I don't know. I mean, they are kind of partners, but it doesn't feel like they're equal partners the way this looks right here, where they're on equal playing fields. Now it looks like China's kind of petting Russia on the head, like a little good dog or something like that. I will say that's what it feels like more and more.
New development, and it wasn't always that way. As a matter of fact,
there's a lot of evidence that there's still tension between these two countries, but they're kind of forced to work together at this moment.
It was basically the opposite, and they came close to a full-blown nuclear war about 50 years ago. The two countries were having constant arguments about where exactly the border was, but the first major clash on Zhenbao Island, called Damansky by the Soviets, turned the dispute into a huge crisis. Each side poured troops to the frontier, and after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, China saw Moscow as an even greater threat. After that first clash, hundreds of Soviet troops backed by tanks and helicopters attacked Chinese Chinese forces at Tieliketi in Xinjiang. At that point, the possibility of these local fights turning into a wider war was pretty high, and both sides already had nukes by that point. Luckily, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai met in September 1969. They agreed to stop the shooting and return to the previous status quo, even though the two sides kept...
It's funny because in a lot of American media and the way the Americans like to present it to their own people, to Americans, we see the communist world as like one unified thing throughout the Cold War, but that was certainly not the case, and this perfectly describes it. There was different forms of communism, and I mean, the rivalry between Russia and China dates back before communism was even a thing in both countries. They had issues in the 19th century as well. Arguably even before that. You have to consider, like, as soon as the Russians started to border the Chinese or whatever it was, the Qing dynasty, whatever form of China that was currently at that time, like, there was certainly going to be tension. Obviously, when the Chinese had their century of humiliation, the Russians definitely did not help that. In fact, they kind of made their century of humiliation, the Chinese century of humiliation, even worse.
China, still suspicious of Moscow, then looked for balance by opening up to the United States. That decision led to Henry Kissinger's secret trip in 1971 and President Richard Nixon's visit in 1972.
I think about this all the time. Like, I mean, for Nixon here, you know, he probably made the right move. He saw like a divide in the communist world. Of course, he's going to want to divide them up. But it's interesting to see what this led to 50 years later, where now China is our biggest rival, and arguably China is getting far closer than the Soviet Union ever did at outcompeting us for the world.
Cuban Missile.
It's crazy. Yeah, so that's why I think about the relationship that got opened up between China and the USA and what things look like now in 2025. Okay,
crisis.
Here's a big one.
For 13 days, the world was at its closest to a nuclear destruction. The United States had placed nuclear-armed missiles in Turkey and Italy, close enough to hit Moscow in minutes. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev then secretly launched Operation Anadir, shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba, hidden under cargo covers. Then, an American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile bases being built in Cuba. When President John F. Kennedy saw the pictures, he called together his top advisors and they debated options. Some generals pushed hard for bombing the sites at once, but...
Side note, but this is the exact reason why the Monroe Doctrine was a thing. This is why the Americans were so aggressive at controlling everyone in Latin America at this time. I mean, they did it before that, but yeah, I mean, once Cuba fell to communism, then especially Cuba of all places, because it is right there off the coast of Florida, Soviet mainland. So once the communist world, the Soviets specifically, got a foothold in North America, like, things like this were going to be a bigger and bigger issue.
Kennedy refused, as he was worried that such an attack would make the Soviets retaliate, even with nuclear weapons. Instead, Kennedy went on television and announced a sort of quarantine of Cuba, a naval blockade to stop more missiles from arriving. The U.S. military was raised to DEFCON 3, one of its highest alert levels. Then, the standoff escalated quickly. Soviet ships went toward the blockade, and Khrushchev sent one message offering to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba, and then another demanding that America also pull its missiles out of Turkey. Meanwhile,
remember, this is at a time where you couldn't just like launch missiles from anywhere. Now we have nukes hidden all around the world in nuclear submarines that can strike anything that we want. But at this time, you had to be physically kind of close to the target.
Fidel Castro, convinced the U.S. was about to invade, urged Moscow to consider launching a nuclear strike first. The most dangerous day came on October.
Castro, bro, what the heck is wrong with you, bro? Relax. Chill.
Also pulled missiles out of Turkey. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro, convinced the U.S. was about to invade, urged Moscow to consider launching a nuclear strike first.
Considering how many times we tried to end this dude, I'm not surprised that Fidel was willing to just throw the whole world away. He definitely was not a fan of the USA. Despised us, in fact.
Dangerous day came on October 27th, later called Black Saturday. A US U-2 was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Major Rudolph Anderson, the only combat fatality of the crisis. At the same time in the Atlantic, US destroyers dropped depth charges near Soviet submarine B-59, not knowing it carried a nuclear torpedo. The captain prepared to fire the nuke, but one man, Officer Vasily Arkhipov, refused to give his consent. That same day, another U-2 accidentally accidentally strayed over Soviet airspace in Siberia. Soviet fighters scrambled, and the U.S. responded with nuclear-armed interceptors to protect and guide the U-2 back into U.S. territory. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, that night, Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, and a deal was made. The U.S. would pledge not to invade Cuba and quietly agree to remove its missiles from Turkey and Italy. In return, the Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba. The next day, Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled, and weeks later, after U.S. reconnaissance confirmed their removal, Kennedy lifted the blockade. Later revelations showed that over 160 nuclear warheads were already in Cuba, including ones that local Soviet commanders had authority to use if
160, that's crazy.
attacked. After all of this, a direct hotline between Washington and
The red phone, yep.
Moscow was set up so leaders could talk instantly in a crisis. Castro felt betrayed by Moscow, excluded from decisions over his own country, and Che Guevara later said that if Cuba had controlled the missiles, he would have launched them, no matter the cost.
Bruh. Bruh, that's a funny one. That is a funny one, just considering how many people love Che Guevara.
And Che Guevara later said that if Cuba had controlled the missiles, he would have launched them, no matter the cost.
Bro. All right.
Once again, though, I recommend checking out...
I'm glad we ended off with the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that is probably, I would say, the Stanislav Petrov, that event, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis is the two closest times ever the world got to World War III. Everything else, like, you could kind of argue, like, is it going to actually be a World War III? Is it going to escalate to that point? That's the thing. Like, we've seen plenty of conflicts. Like, this is a perfect conflict of, like, well, there was an American that died, a soldier that died, or conflict. People were dying, but we still didn't ultimately launch the nukes. So that is the thing. I thought I was the only one that was really surprised by James Blunt. It's a miracle we are alive this day despite these close calls. I think about that all the time. I mean, most people that are watching this, I would assume, is younger than me. But even I, like, probably shouldn't even have existed with so many of these close calls and these conflicts here. How we're still alive to this day is amazing. The 1971 Bangladesh War and 1956 Suez Crisis were also situations that could have escalated. Yeah, I mean, he only decided to focus on 8 events. There's definitely more than just that, but I feel like he covered a lot of the big ones. That video is by The Paint Explainer. Loved it. And here's a big thank you to this month's patrons. Can white people smell the rain? It's pronounced Tour de Sillas, DruuuWu Labubu. Conquered Bread. White Grape of the Pirates. Never change, Drew. Unless you want to. LuxembourgLover. Fredrik Tibblin. Pavlik. KingBearHaze. NordTyrol. LoreTrack. Name here. Nolan. Check the Patreon link down below in the description.